After a long delay, I am finally back. It took a very long time for me to get my wits about me, but, you know, once you have everything secured down and you feel nice and secure where you're at in your life, you have a tendency to find your own stability rather than relying on drugs, which is the topic of today. Honestly, it's a little overdue. This is a topic I myself have been researching for quite some time now, and I'd like to share it with the world. This is actually a report generated by an AI, and there are some issues with it, and I'll get into what those issues are once I actually get into what the actual report is about. But essentially, it's about iatrogenic harm caused by the very system here in America. There are other places in the world where this is not a problem, but here in America, for some reason, we just love making people sick and making them dependent on Social Security, which is sad, really. So let's go ahead and dive in, shall we? The name of the report: Systemic Iatrogenic Battery, a longitudinal meta-analysis of preemptive pediatric psychiatric interventions and long-term systemic failure. Introduction. The clinical paradigm governing pediatric psychiatry has undergone a profound transformation over the last 3 decades, pivoting away from acute management of established severe mental illness towards a preemptive and prodromal identification of subclinical psychological distress. When they say subclinical, they usually just mean it's not presenting right now, but it will. Driven by the hypothesis that earlier pharmacological intervention can arrest the neurodevelopmental progression of psychiatric disorders, diagnostic and treatment protocols have radically expanded to target children and adolescents ages 3 to 18 who display attenuated symptoms, behavioral noncompliance, and mere genetic vulnerabilities, which we can actually dissect genetic vulnerabilities because it's pretty weak. Yeah, PWAS studies, you got up of it, and GWAS is even worse. However, an exhaustive longitudinal review of non-neurobiological, endocrinological, genomic, and epidemiological data over the past half-century reveals a catastrophic contradiction. The very interventions intended to prevent chronicity appear to mathematically and biologically guarantee it. When analyzing longitudinal outcomes exceeding 10 years, a deeply disturbing phenomenological and epidemiological picture emerges. The administration of neuroleptics, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, popular topic right now, which I would actually argue that some use of SSRIs is appropriate, but long-term use is actually not. And psychostimulants to the developing pediatric brain initiates a cascade of iatrogenic damage categorized by accelerated cortical thinning, profound suppression of the growth hormone axis, and priming of the mesolimbic system for lifelong dopamine supersensitivity. Furthermore, the reliance on polygenic risk scores and clinical high-risk screening tools demonstrates an unacceptable false discovery rate resulting in unwarranted chemical alteration of fundamentally healthy youth. Synthesizing these longitudinal data points necessitates a radical reframing of preemptive pediatric psychiatry. The long-term societal and clinical outcomes marked by skyrocketed rates of Social Security insurance transitions and the chronification of episodic affective disorders and the intractable completions suggest that these pharmacological interventions operate less than as a medical treatment and more as a systemic vector for iatrogenic harm. Ultimately, the empirical evidence indicates that forced and coerced application of prodromal psychopharmacology produces neurobiological markers virtually indistinguishable from complex post-traumatic stress disorder and specialized torture, framing the current standard of care as systemic form of iatrogenic battery. You know, the funny thing is that when I actually created the prompt for this, I didn't actually include specialized torture or complex post-traumatic stress disorder as things to include within the report. But it is shockingly accurate. And to those of you who don't believe that complex post-traumatic stress disorder exists, I'm sorry. Why don't you open up an ICD-11? It's right there. Hey, yeah, I can actually do you a favor. I can include it in the comment section. Just this link to it, so you can just look at it. Because apparently, here in America, it doesn't exist. Or it exists buried underneath a mountain of subsections and subtypes of post-traumatic stress disorder, which I don't want to get into that one, because one of them is acute. Well, not acute, because it's obviously long-term, and it can impact you for a number of years if left untreated. But, I mean, oh man, I can't right now, because I know that a lot of times post-traumatic stress disorder goes untreated. And I gotta tell you, like, when it becomes a statement of value that your trauma just isn't bad enough to qualify, rather than the profound impacts on your neurobiology, then there's something to be said here. Like, I mean, there's so many different ways to describe it. And I know, the DSM is primarily a bunch of hypothetical behavioral disorders that don't necessarily tie back to any individual, like, pathology. But don't you see that's a problem? Of course you do. Why wouldn't you? All right, getting on with it. The chemical lobotomy and developmental stunting. The traditional psychiatric hypothesis maintains that progressive brain volume changes observed in populations diagnosed with severe mental illness are solely the result of an underlying progressive disease process. However, the advent of advanced longitudinal neuroimaging has systematically dismantled this assumption. High-resolution magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, tracking both drug-naive and heavily medicated cohorts over extended durations indicates that the mainstay of prodromal treatment, primarily neuroleptics, acts as primary driver of cortical tissue decrement and microstructural white matter degradation and delayed physical maturation. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Let me go ahead and break that down for you. So essentially, they're saying the neuroimaging parts, it shows other things. And then when they say drug naive, they usually mean someone who hasn't taken neuroleptics before, aka antipsychotics, or even any psychotropic drug, which I'm going to use that term instead of medication because, I mean, they're drugs. They're mind-altering. That's what they do. And I'm sorry that hurts all of you so much. Now let's see. Heavily medicated cohorts, I'm pretty sure anybody with a brain can figure that out. It just means that people who have been medicated heavily over the course of their childhood, and I already identified neuroleptics as being basically antipsychotics, which there are a number of different generations to go into, but we won't get into that. Cortical tissue decrement, essentially, it just means your synapses prune themselves. And microstructural white matter degradation, there's something called, what is it called? Anyways, it's the little white thing that goes around a lot of your your neurons in your brain. I'll think of it here in a second. But white matter is the stuff that has lots of that. Myelination, there we go. Myelination, which that's just fat that goes around your neurons and prevents excessive transmission between neurons. And then delayed physical maturation, as I said, you basically don't go through puberty. Alright, moving on. Longitudinal frontal gray matter volume loss. I need to slow down, don't I? The analysis of frontal gray matter volume in pediatric and adolescent populations highlight the dramatically separating wave of structural loss that is directly correlated with antipsychotic exposure. In early onset psychosis, and childhood onset schizophrenia, the natural trajectory of the disorder does involve some post-adolescent synaptic pruning. In other words, the disorders in and of themselves can cause some, well, neuronal loss, or loss within brain function. There you go. That's the best way to put that. However, the introduction of neuroleptic molecules radically accelerates, amplifies, and exacerbates this process. Now, this is where this paper gets this wrong, because it's trying to make a distinction that's not there. Paul Thompson and colleagues, utilizing high-resolution cortical mapping, demonstrated this dynamic wave of accelerated gray matter loss spreads from parietal cortices at disease onset to encompass temporal and frontal regions, with the rates and temporal sequencing of cortical loss heavily influenced by medication status during teenage years. Wrong. That is not what that says. Essentially, what that study says is that there is observed, and this is from I think 2002, so it's over 20 years old at this point, but it causes loss. The disease itself has shown to cause loss. And one thing that this particular study demonstrated was that there were certain parts of the brain that showed gain from taking neuroleptics. Now, if you go back and actually take a look at which parts of the brain that they're referring to that had those gains, you notice that in recent studies, it's basically been shown that when these areas are enlarged, you see much more profound symptomology out of your patients. In other words, they present worse and they get worse. Remember, kids, just because something shows any kind of growth doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. Like if you see amount of mass growing in your brain, not always good. It just means that your brain is adapting. The Iowa longitudinal study provided definitive large-scale evidence for this iatrogenic etiology, tracking 211 patients, yielding 674 high-resolution magnetic resonance scans for up to 14 years. Now, this is the actual long-term study that actually looked into long-term exposure to neuroleptics, whereas some of the other studies that I'm going to quote in the description are short-term. They are only studying, I think, a period of 3 to 8 weeks, which is not very long when you're thinking about things. Now, if you want to actually go through that specific period and say, hey, this is for acute stabilization, I would say, that's a good point. Maybe you should think about doing that. But as far as prolonged maintenance doses, it's not going to help. It's probably going to make them worse. Anyways, getting back to topic, researchers evaluated the relative contributions of illness duration, antipsychotic treatment, illness severity, and substance abuse on progressive brain volume changes. The findings were unequivocal. Greater intensity and duration of antipsychotic treatment were strictly associated with global indicators of generalized and specific brain tissue reduction. Crucially, more antipsychotic treatment directly correlated with smaller gray matter volumes and progressive decrements in white matter volume. Essentially, if you know any difference between those two things, let me go ahead and just explain that. Gray matter is unmyelinated. It doesn't have the coating on it. Whereas white matter is the stuff that's got all that fatty coating. So you're going to have a lot more transmission through gray matter. And when you start seeing smaller gray matter volumes and reductions in white matter as well, you start seeing a very specific trend that can no longer be ignored because it's actually literal brain damage. Illness severity had only relatively modest correlations to tissue volume reduction compared to the overwhelming variable of medication exposure and illicit drug misuse, had no significant associations when effects of other variables were adjusted, like stress, trauma, psychotropic drugs. Even in the extremely short term, the structural remodeling force by neuroleptics is evident. A prospective cohort study of antipsychotic naive patients scanned at baseline and again at 3 to 8 weeks reveals significant and persistent gray matter reduction in left medial frontal gyrus. Yeah, They did show that. They also showed those areas of the brain that I was referring to that make symptoms worse. They showed those to be bigger. And then they tried to quote that it's somehow a good thing. This is good. We should do more of this. Well, researchers noted transient volume increases in the striatum, right caudate, and caudate, and thalamus at early intervals. This is widely understood to represent an acute inflammatory or compensatory glial response to massive D2 receptor blockade, which eventually gives way to long-term atrophy. So, yeah, about 6 weeks or so. I mean, you could argue it's definitely neuroinflammation, because your brain is in fact being told, we're going to block this stuff that is not only responsible for mood and hallucinations and what else do they tell you? Attention, dopamine. D2 is dopamine, by the way. But it's also responsible for movement, which is why you have tardive dyskinesia and what do they call that other one? I think it's just dyskinesia in general, which is basically restlessness. But tardive dyskinesia is when patients kind of go, and I know it looks funny, but it's really tragic when you actually get into the real problems behind it. And you can give them antihistamines, and it will reduce that. And you're typically just going to see this in first-generation antipsychotics, and it does, it reduces that. And sometimes patients are rendered unable to talk, and then when they take an antihistamine, they're magically able to talk again. But yeah, no, I don't even think that should even be necessary. No one should be taking any first-generation antipsychotic for more than like a week or two while they're being acutely stabilized, and they should be transitioned to less destructive medications. Alright. A prospective cohort study of antipsychotic naive patients scanned at baseline and again at 3 to 8 weeks revealed significant persistent gray. Okay, I already read that. Alright, let's see. D2 gives way to long-term atrophy. Okay, yeah, I already read that. That's why I got into that there. In a pediatric population, specifically diffusion-weighted MRI indices such as fractional anisotropy, FA, axial diffusion, and radial diffusion revealed deep microstructural white matter alterations unmedicated adolescents with EOP present with specific white matter variations compared to healthy controls such as lower FA in the anterior corona rodentia and radiata, there we go, corona radiata, and superior longitudinal fasciculus, superior longitudinal fasciculus. There we go. That's what happens when we don't say these things out loud. However, the introduction of second-generation antipsychotics heavily alters the microstructural landscape. Medicated patients exhibit artificially higher FA values in the left anterior corona radiata compared to unmedicated peers, a shift driven by unnatural increases in axial diffusion and decreases in radial diffusion that masquerade as normalization of the brain while fundamentally altering myelin integrity and tract organization. In other words, like, it can show that it's normal, but once you kind of zoom in on it, you start to see that there's some differences, especially when it comes to that little sheath that goes around your neurons, and also how your neurons are organizing and connecting to each other in many ways. I mean, to say that it's ultimately a reduction would be a misnomer, because that's not how the brain works. Importantly, the lack of dose-response relationship suggests that the mere presence of antipsychotic medication rather than the specific cumulative dose is sufficient to induce these structural alterations. The narrative of atypical brain maturation in medicated children is therefore intrinsically linked to long-term cognitive decline and symptom progression. By suppressing dopaminergic and serotonergic signaling during the critical neurodevelopmental window of adolescence, ages 12 to 18, the brain's natural maturation sequence is forcefully interrupted, mimicking the profound neuroanatomical deficits historically observed in frontal lobotomies. Yeah, that is quite literally a chemical lobotomy, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not at all exaggerating, and neither is this report. Like, essentially, all the stuff that I said prior is telling you that you are lobotomizing children, but you don't want to admit to lobotomizing children since you're not using an ice pick, which is, on the surface, more brutal. So you can hide behind that little colored pill, whatever the pill may be, yellow, blue, magenta. I don't know. I don't look at the pills. Alright, so here we have a little chart that the AI put together for us. And here's what we're going to go ahead and do. Global gray matter. Unmedicated developmental trajectory, baseline disease-related synaptic pruning and stabilization. Medicated trajectory, longitudinal antipsychotic exposure, aka long-term. Accelerated and persistent volume loss heavily correlated with treatment intensity, aka if you're taking more of the drug, which you usually do because you develop a tolerance for it, it's going to cause worsening effects. Long-term clinical and functional implications, severe long-term cognitive decline, irreversible loss of executive function and intellectual capacity. Oh man, this hurts my heart. Like, it's just knowing where this current mental health crisis is coming from, and just no one believes you because they think you're crazy. And then you have politicians like Robert F. Kennedy talking about, like, environmental without actually naming the environmental factors responsible for a lot of this. And I know I speak controversially, but it's not out of malice, just out of disappointment that so many people who think they're doing the world good are actually causing so much unmitigated harm. Let me go ahead and just scroll this down, so if you want, you can look at it, take it in, then we can proceed on to the next section, and then after that I'm going to pause the video because I'm going to be doing this in intervals. I just need to take a quick swig real quick of the water in my apartment. Water is good. Well, not this water, but water in general is good. You should drink more water. Tell your patients to drink more water. Oh wait, that's right, that's become a symptom. If a patient drinks too much water, they might have a psychotic illness. Oh no. Don't drink too much water, kids. They might diagnose you with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or OCD because you drink too much water. Man. All right, moving on, because I'm being a goofball right now. And there, if you want to read that, you can do that too. All right. Neuroleptic-induced pituitary dysfunction and pubertal arrest. The structural suppression of central nervous system extends directly downwards into the endocrine system, aka your hormones, all the hormone feeling bits, specifically devastating the hypothalamic, pituitary, gonadal, and growth hormone axes. Thing that make thing go grow, the growth hormone axes, axis, and the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal. I don't think I need to say what that's for. Those of you who know what gonadal means, I'm pretty sure you know. The transition between childhood and emerging adulthood depends biologically upon reawakening of the HPG axis, heralded by the pulsatile secretion of gonadotrophin, releasing hormone GnRH. Remember that one, kiddies. From the hypothalamus, which stimulates the pituitary release of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Yeah, you kids know how you get that hair in funny places. That's how that happens. Neuroleptics, particularly risperidone and paliperidone, aggressively block dopamine D2 receptors not only in the mesolimbic pathways but also in the anterior pituitary gland. Because dopamine acts as the primary physiological inhibitor of prolactin secretion, aka the hormone that gives you boobies. These blockades unleash massive and unsustained hyperprolactemia, which can lead to men growing boobies. In prepubescent and adolescent children, chronic hyperprolactemia actively suppresses the upstream release of GnRH. This in turn halts the downstream release of LH and FSH, creating a state where severe functional hypogonadism, that means it's not like it's below normal. That's what that means. Hypo means below normal. The downstream symptomatic failures are catastrophic for a developing child. Adolescents subjected to these molecules experience delayed or complete arrest of pubertal maturation and absence of vital pubertal growth spurts, lower insulin growth factor 1 secretion, and severely reduced bone mineral density. So I'm going to go ahead and just cover one of these because this only applies to a certain class of drugs, which risperidone actually belongs to, which is the atypical antipsychotics, which are generation 2 antipsychotics, which are more associated with metabolic disorders like diabetes. And you'll notice this because a lot of people who are on type 2 antipsychotics have a tendency to gain a lot of weight, which bless their hearts. It doesn't make them ugly. It just means that they're taking a medication that fundamentally screws with their ability to process the nutrients that their body's taking in. So they are both starving and fat, which is really tragic when you think about it, because it's not necessarily that their appetite is suppressed. It's that their body just doesn't know how to process nutrients, so it converts it all into adipose. And that's really tragic. Furthermore, central nervous system stimulants such as methylphenidate and amphetamine derivatives, aka Adderall, and I think methylphenidate, that's Ritalin, and SSRIs, I think it's Ritalin, it also could be another one. SSRIs exhibit their own independent stunting mechanisms. Evidence demonstrates that SSRI use during adolescence is associated with up to 1 centimeter length longitudinal growth for every year. Less longitudinal growth for every year of treatment, heavily impacting the children in Tanner stages 3 and 4 of puberty, which we'll get into Tanner stages at a later date. This attenuation in growth velocity is directly linked to serotonin-mediated alterations and suppression of growth hormone secretion. Similarly, the long-term administration of stimulants leads to profound weight and height deficits, which this is the opposite of atypical antipsychotics. This actually causes them to have trouble gaining weight, which is also very tragic. The attenuation in growth velocity is directly linked to serotonin-mediated alteration, suppression of growth hormone secretion. Similarly, The long-term administration of stimulants leads to profound weight and height deficits, often necessitating pediatric endocrine consultations to rule out primary hypothyroidism and endogenous GH deficiency. In other words, you're not producing enough of your hormones because your hormones have been fried. Thanks, guys. The suppression of appetite and direct central nervous system overriding of metabolic signals leaves children failing to meet fundamental developmental milestones. By initiating prodromal treatment, the psychiatric paradigm traps the pediatric patient in a state of physical and neurobiological infancy. The disruption of puberty is not merely a cosmetic or secondary side effect. Puberty is a biological engine driving the final maturation of the prefrontal cortex, your thinky bits. And why it's kind of messed up when we start talking about these cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's being used on drug patients who fundamentally cannot utilize them while they are being drugged, because these drugs interfere with their ability to think rationally, because it interferes with the prefrontal cortex. Freezing this biological process ensures that a child cannot develop the psychosocial and neurological maturation required to independently regulate emotional distress, thereby permanently cementing their reliance on the medical system. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what everybody's calling autistic burnout. When we have the data to suggest that the medications that we're prescribing children are actually causing a lot of these symptoms, but we don't want to actually take accountability for that by just simply stopping their overuse, we instead double down on it here in America. Just keep on doubling down. I kid you not, that is exactly what you are seeing here. And at this point in the game, the only thing I can really tell you is that if you are a teenager or a child who's having to go through these things right now, I'm sorry. If you are a professional who is putting children on these things right now because you think that you are helping them, you aren't. Not the way you're doing it right now. Now, if there is an acute reason to administer these drugs to stabilize a patient, fine, use it. But long-term, maintenance doses cause more damage and harm than they resolve. And there is more than enough evidence out there to suggest this. And the rest of the world knows it, and they're starting to catch on to the whole thing. But for some reason, here in America, we just want to keep it all quiet. Why? Money? Politics? Power? Or maybe it's just ego. This concludes part 1. I'll be picking this back up. The priming of addiction and the sensitization loop. You're creating the very addictions you're trying to treat.